of this presentation on the subject matter shall be sent to you in email for your future references. Now, without taking any further time, I request Mr. Gaurav Jain to start addressing the audience and proceed. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Aman, and thank you for warm introduction. First of all, I would like to congratulate Taxman for choosing this topic of black money law because it is the right time to discuss this topic. While black money law, as we will see in our subsequent slides, was introduced in 2015, but proceedings under that law have started in right earnest only recently, and we only saw the first batch of orders in the year ending 31st March 2021. So and so we should as a professionals, as assessees, we should know what are the nuances of this law, how to handle it, what kind of arguments can be taken before the appellate courts to defend our stand against the tax authorities. So without taking much time on the background, I'll proceed with my presentation. My presentation is divided into 5 topics. That is, first I'll give the overview of the law, how it is connected with income tax, what is the meaning and scope of undisclosed foreign asset, which is the main subject matter of this topic and which is brought to tax under this new law. What are the arguments relating to the retrospectivity or prospectivity of this law vis-a-vis undisclosed assets or income? And what is the assessment procedure that the revenue authorities can adopt while making assessment under this new law? Now, before I come to the law, what was the background behind, what is the intent behind introduction of this law? Because when we will see this law in detail in subsequent slides, we will notice that the subject matter of taxation in the law is similar to what is there in Income Tax Act, in as much as Income Tax Act also charges undisclosed foreign income of residents, undisclosed assets of the Indian residents. Then what was the need of the law? And so why was this law at all brought in? The idea was to bring a more focused law to target foreign income, foreign assets. And the background behind that was there were various media reports time and again which were disclosing that enormous, humongous wealth of Indian residents was parked in foreign countries, more particularly in Swiss accounts, Geneva accounts. So few media highlights the amount of wealth which was parked in foreign bank accounts I have enumerated in my slide number 2. So as a result of these media reports, in fact, many prominent citizens of the country, more particularly senior advocate Shri Ram Jethmalani ji, filed a PIL before the Supreme Court seeking directions from the court that government should act in bringing this money stashed outside India. As a result of the proceedings before Supreme Court, the Supreme Court directed constitution of a special investigation team, which was to be headed by a retired Supreme Court judge, to bring out a report as to what could be the mannerism in which this menace of black money outside India could be handled. And friends, why this was important is that while we are aware of parallel economy being prevalent within the country, but still that is not a big problem than the parallel economy outside India, since the black money within the country somehow find its roots back to the Indian economy, unlike the black money outside India, which remains outside, which never enters the Indian economy. So for that reason, the foreign income, foreign black money was considered to be a more draconian menace than the prevalent black money in India. So as a result thereof, the special investigation team gave a report to the government to come out with a new law which should be more harsh, more draconian, to provide two ways. One, to penalize the assessees who have parked their money outside India, and ways and means to bring that money within India. And we'll see how the black money seeks to cover that. Apart from that, the SIT also suggested that before the law is introduced, an option should also be given to the assessees to voluntarily declare their income assets outside India before the law sets in. So as a result of the recommendation of the SIT, the undisclosed, which is called Black Money Undisclosed Foreign Income and Assets Bill, was introduced in 2015, which was passed by the president on 26th May 2015 as Imposition of Tax Act, as Undisclosed Foreign Income and Assets Act 2015. Originally the effective date of the act was kept as 1/4/2016, which was subsequently predated to 1/7/2015 in order to enable a voluntary disclosure scheme, which was also made part of the act. Under the voluntary disclosure scheme, the assessees were given option to declare their assets and income prior up to assessment year 2016-17 by 30th September 2015. And in order to effectuate that scheme, the act was subsequently predated from 1/4/2016 to 1/7/2015. Now, what did the bill provide? Bill provided taxation of undisclosed foreign income and assets of Indian residents with related penalty and prosecutions. The second most important provision which was proposed in the bill was a corresponding amendment to Prevention of Money Laundering Act, whereby the offense under the Black Money Act was considered as a scheduled offense. And what are the consequences of it? We will deal it subsequently. And then, as I pointed out, a one-time compliance opportunity was provided to the assessees. So this is the background as to how the act was introduced and promulgated in the year 2015. Now, what is the overall scope? What is the overall scope of this Black Money Act? Friends, Black Money Act seeks to tax. The scope of the act is divided into two parts. One, the assessment of undisclosed foreign assets of Indian residents and undisclosed foreign income of Indian residents. So unlike Income Tax Act, which only taxes income of an assessee of a resident in India, the Black Money Act seeks to divide the scope of the charge into two parts: one, undisclosed foreign assets, and another, undisclosed foreign income. While undisclosed foreign income, it is clearly, the act language of the act is clear that undisclosed foreign income can be brought to tax only if it is earned after assessment year 2016-17 and onwards. In other words, only the foreign income earned after AY 16-17 can be subject matter of BMA. The income earned prior to AY 16-17 will be outside the scope of BMA and could be taxed only under the Income Tax Act. But whether the foreign assets acquired prior to 1/4/2016 is subject matter of BMA or not is a subject matter of debate. The stand of the government is that all the old assets can be subjected to tax under BMA, but the assessees are arguing no, there could be no retrospective effect of the BMA, and therefore the old acquisitions of foreign assets should be outside the BMA and they can be taxed only if at all in accordance with provisions of Income Tax Act or any other prevalent law prior to 1/4/2016. We will see whether or not the act could be considered as prospective or could be considered as retrospective in our later slides. But still, for the present moment, we need to see that the scope of BMA is divided into undisclosed foreign assets and undisclosed foreign income. The rate of tax prescribed is 30% of the value of undisclosed foreign income and value of undisclosed foreign assets. Undisclosed foreign assets are to be valued at the fair market value. A specific valuation rules have been prescribed in law. We will have a brief snapshot of the valuation rules in my subsequent slides, and along with the undisclosed foreign income. And if it can be proved that a foreign asset has been acquired out of foreign income, then the reduction of that foreign income is available from the value of undisclosed foreign asset, and the total of both the foreign income and foreign asset is subjected to tax at the rate of 30%. Then the value is on the gross basis. The rate of tax is on gross basis in as much as no deduction of any expenditure, allowance, set off of any loss is available against the gross income which is brought to tax under BMA. The valuation has been prescribed in Black Money Undisclosed Foreign Income Tax Rules 2015, which are the valuation rules appended to the Act. Broadly, the fair market value is determined on the basis of the price, which is the market value which would be fetched for an asset in the open market. For instance, in case of immovable property, it is provided that FMV will be as per the local valuer report. So for instance, in India, it is the circle rate. So in case of a foreign asset, it has been prescribed that a local valuer's report can be obtained to determine the fair market value. In case of quoted shares, the fair market value is on the basis of average price listed on the stock exchange. The only deviation from fair market value is in case of unquoted shares, or in case of a share in a partnership firm, where the net assets value as per books of the company or of the partnership firm is considered as the fair market value. So it is the cost of acquisition or fair market value of the foreign assets which is to be considered as value of the property. An important point which can be taken note of in the valuation rules is that valuation rules prescribe a separate method for valuation of shares, as I have just explained above. So in case of an individual having shares in a foreign company, as per the scheme of the act read with the valuation rules, it is the fair market value of the shares which should be considered as the undisclosed foreign asset to be brought to tax. But in practice, we have seen that the officers disregard the valuation concept for shares, but consider the bank balances in the bank account of the foreign company as the value of asset in the hands of individual. So that distinction needs to be drawn, and we can draw support from the valuation rules that it is not the bank balance of the foreign company which is to be considered as foreign asset, but the value of that company, value of the shares of the company, that should only be considered as the asset for the purposes of BMA. The third important point, the third deviation or an important aspect dealt in the valuation rules is the valuation of the bank account. Now the question is whether bank account at all be considered as an asset or not, because it is only a bank balance which could comprise of income which is separately taxed under BMA. It could comprise of loans which are not in the nature of income, and therefore the loan balance cannot be considered as an asset. But notwithstanding this legal position, the valuation rules prescribe that all the credits in the bank account, sum total of all the credits in the bank account, will be considered as value of the bank account for the purposes of charge of tax under BMA. The only credit that has been provided in the valuation rules is if the credit in the bank account is out of withdrawals from the bank account, then the credit of those withdrawals will be given. This is something similar to the concept of peak credit, which we see in the income tax, that only the peak balance of the credits in the bank account can be deemed as income. It is somewhat that provision which has been incorporated in the valuation rules. But the larger question is whether all the credits in the bank account could at all be considered as assets, because foreign income which is deposited in the bank account prior to 1/4/2016 is otherwise outside the ambit of BMA. It is through the circuitous route that the legislature seeks to cover income of the earlier years by treating it as an asset if it is deposited in the bank account. So this is also a subject matter of challenge. Bone of contention can be raised before the appellate forums whether the old balances deposited in the bank accounts can at all be considered as asset, and whether the valuation rules can go beyond the scope of the main substantive provision which specifically provides that foreign income can be taxed only if it is earned after 1/4/2016. This is valuation rules. And apart from tax, the law prescribes for various provisions relating to penalty and prosecution. The first is with respect to penalty. The law straight away provides for penalty that can be imposed by the assessing officer at the rate of 300% of tax on total undisclosed foreign income and assets. So there is no provision, unlike Income Tax Act, where the option is given to the assessing officers to levy tax at the rate of 100% to 300%. BMA provides for a straight rate of 300% of the tax as penalty. Apart from the penalty at the rate of 300%, there is an additional penalty of rupees 10 lakh each for failure to disclose foreign assets in the return of income, or if there is a failure to file return of income per se. This penalty of rupees 10 lakhs is in addition to penalty of 300%, and there could be instances where, while there is no penalty of 300% because there could be no tax for undisclosed foreign asset or income, but still I could be subject to penalty of rupees 10 lakhs. For illustration purposes, I can explain. So let us say if a resident in India had earned income outside India from foreign sources, which was not taxable in India for the reason of either on the source rule or by virtue of exemption available under DTA or for any other reason, that while income was earned by resident in India outside but was not taxable in India, but still, although it was not taxable in India, there was failure on the part of assessee to disclose such income or asset acquired outside India in the return of income. So the fact that the income, foreign income, has been earned out of taxable sources, out of tax paid income earned outside India, but because of the failure to disclose in the return of income, the assessee could still be subject to penalty of 10 lakhs, even if there was no penalty at the rate of 300% or there was no tax under the BMA. So this is how penalty of rupees 10 lakhs should be seen, which is automatic, notwithstanding any tax payable under BMA. And the similar offense of failure to disclose in ROI or failure to disclose to file the ROI per se, apart from penalty, is also subject to prosecution under the BMA, and the rigors of prosecution in BMA are higher than what they are under the Income Tax Act, in as much as the term period prescribed for prosecution is higher. It is 10 years. There is no mechanism of compounding of offense of prosecution, unlike that is available under the Income Tax Act. And then the last most important amendment, as I discussed earlier, is that the offense under the BMA has been covered as a scheduled offense under PMLA. So what is, friends, what is the consequence of the offense to be considered as part of PMLA? In other words, the holding of foreign assets or earning of foreign income will be considered as proceeds of crime, and therefore the PMLA authorities gets power to attach the foreign assets. They can exercise their powers under the international treaties to attach those assets to bring that money back to India. That's one. And two, we would be aware that under PMLA, it is not only the initial offender which is subject to penalties under PMLA, but any person who is associated with the proceeds of crime gets covered under the offense under PMLA. So in case of foreign income and foreign assets, it is not only the assessee, but any person who is connected with the offense of earning foreign assets or foreign income would be subject matter of PMLA proceedings. And even if he has earned income, for instance, if a professional has assisted an Indian resident to open a bank account outside India, even that professional can be subject to proceedings under PMLA. So it is that width and substance of the new BMA which is considered to be more harsh, more draconian than Income Tax Act, and that's why this special law was promulgated by the legislature. Now, friends, the third topic which I am including in my presentation is what is the interplay of black money law with Income Tax Act. As we have seen that the scope and width of subject matter of income under BMA is similar to Income Tax Act only, in as much as we all are aware that if a resident in India has earned foreign income, under Income Tax Act also the global income of resident in India is chargeable to tax under the Income Tax Act. So it is the same income which has been made subject matter of tax under BMA. Even the foreign assets can also be subjected to tax under Income Tax Act, because there are series of sections in section 69A that if any undisclosed asset of a resident is found, then that asset will be deemed as undisclosed income of the assessee. So when we see Income Tax Act itself had provisions to tax foreign income and foreign assets of resident in India. So in that sense, there is a sort of overlap in the subject matter of assets and income in the BMA as well as Income Tax Act. But still, there is one section 4, subsection 3 in BMA Act which seeks to resolve this interplay by providing that when an asset or income is charged under the BMA, then it will be exempted from tax under the Income Tax Act, giving primacy to BMA over Income Tax Act, and therefore making both the acts mutually exclusive, removing the overlap in both the statutes. That's one. And then, friends, while the subject matter of income and assets is common, but still BMA is the provisions of valuation, and there are substantial provisions which are different in BMA than Income Tax Act. For instance, under BMA, the asset is charged at fair market value, whereas in Income Tax Act, it is only the acquisition price of the asset which could have been deemed as income. So in that sense, BMA enhances the value of asset while levying tax. Then the BMA do not allow deduction of expenses earned to earn foreign income or to acquire foreign asset. Then there are rigorous provisions of penalty prosecution, as we discussed, 300% penalty, more term in case of prosecution, no facility of compounding of prosecution. In income tax, earlier we had the provision of settlement of cases through the route of settlement commission. It's a different matter that it has recently been abolished. But at the time when the law was promulgated, while Income Tax Act had the facility of settlement commission, there was no provision of settlement under the BMA. So in that sense, the BMA Act is substantially different, substantially harsh vis-a-vis Income Tax Act. Then, friends, BMA, as per the intent, when we see the preamble, when we see the press release, when the act was promulgated, the whole idea was that the menace of holding foreign assets and foreign income has to be specifically dealt with by bringing a focused law. So that makes BMA as a specific law vis-a-vis Income Tax Act. So according to me, by applying the theory of special law over general law, the BMA should hold the field where a resident is found to have earned foreign income and foreign asset. That is, BMA would prevail over Income Tax Act. So friends, therefore, because of the intent behind introduction of law, because of the provisions of Section 4.3, which gives a minus to the Income Tax Act, it is the black money law which will be prevail, and it is only the one law, that is BMA, where tax will be charged and there is no scope of double taxation. The problem that arises is when income tax authorities start proceedings under the Income Tax Act and subsequently they realize that no, the issue of foreign income or foreign asset should be dealt in BMA. So whether income tax authorities have power to drop the income tax proceedings and start under BMA, this will be an open question. But in my view, friends, when income tax authorities have started proceedings under Income Tax Act, which also covers the subject matter of foreign income and foreign assets, then to the extent the proceedings have started and they have not been properly dropped, proceedings under BMA cannot be started. The way we have a concept of inchoate proceedings under the Income Tax Act, we have series of decisions from the Supreme Court that when one proceedings have been initiated, unless they are properly closed, the proceedings under a different provision cannot be started by the AOs. And if those proceedings have been started, the courts have come down heavily to quash those subsequent proceedings. So applying that principle, friends, if a proceeding to charge foreign income and foreign asset is initiated under Income Tax Act, according to me, an objection should be raised that unless those proceedings are properly dropped, BMA proceedings cannot be started or they are outside the jurisdiction. And we have somewhat a decision from Gujarat High Court on this very issue, where the Gujarat High Court has thrown or given sort of a partial relief to an assessee where originally the proceedings were initiated by tax authorities under Income Tax Act. The assessee approached Settlement Commission to settle those matters. There was no objection raised by the income tax authorities when the matter was proceeding in the Settlement Commission. No objection, co-assumption of jurisdiction by the Settlement Commission. But when the Settlement Commission order was passed, the department initiated BMA proceedings saying, no, this is a subject matter of BMA. BMA being a specific law this should be applicable and not the income tax, and therefore the settlement commission order should be quashed. Gujarat High Court came heavily upon the tax authorities to say that when department has itself initiated proceedings under income tax, when the proceedings were under initiation, the assessee approached settlement commission, they did not object to the continuation of proceedings before settlement commission, then in such circumstances the tax authorities cannot now take a U-turn to say that the order of settlement commission is bad in law because the subject matter is under BMA and not under Income Tax Act. So friends, this decision is somewhat similar to the theory of inchoate proceedings, which I just discussed, that when proceedings have been initiated under one provision or under one law, then unless they are specifically dropped, proceedings cannot be initiated under different law or under a different provision. And we also have a recent decision of Mumbai Bench of Tribunal in the case of Yashovardhan Birla. In that case, friends, what happened, that there were earlier wealth tax proceedings in the case of assessee. Assessee was found to be a beneficiary in an offshore trust. Now, when the wealth and the department in the wealth tax proceedings sought to charge the assets of the trust in the hands of assessee on the ground that he is beneficiary of the trust, those proceedings were deleted. The addition under wealth tax made was deleted by the tribunal on the ground that till the time the assets are distributed to the beneficiary cannot be said to be owner of any asset. That order was accepted by the income tax department, by the wealth tax authorities. Now, having taken that stand in the wealth tax proceedings, the tribunal in this case held that the tax authorities cannot now take a U-turn to say that when they have accepted that this is not an asset under the Wealth Tax Act, it cannot also be an asset under the BMA, because the scope of definition of ownership in both the acts remain the same. When they have accepted that assessee is not the owner of the assets of the offshore of the assets in the offshore trust in the wealth tax proceedings, they cannot take a U-turn, they cannot take a different stand in the BMA proceedings. They applied the theory of appropriate and probate, that is, the department cannot blow hot and cold at the same time, take a different stand in one proceedings and take a different stance in other proceedings. So friend, in this background, we need to reconcile the scope and ambit of both the laws and decide where an assessee is to be taxed. According to me, BMA should prevail over Income Tax Act. But if the income tax authorities initiate proceedings under the Income Tax Act, then they cannot suddenly subsequently say, no, this is not a matter of Income Tax Act but should have been taxed under BMA. If they have started the proceedings under Income Tax Act, they should complete the proceedings under Income Tax Act only and not bring the assessee under the BMA. So friends, we should keep in mind this distinction while making our defenses against BMA orders or income tax proceedings before the relevant tax forums. Then friends, one overlap of income tax and BMA could be in the years preceding AY 2016-17, because as I pointed out, the foreign income which can be brought to tax under BMA is only with effect from assessment year 16-17, and the department's view is that assets acquired prior to 16-17 can be taxed under BMA. So there could be a case that while income earned prior to 16-17 can be brought to tax under the Income Tax Act, but the assets acquired out of that income which are parked outside India can be brought to tax under BMA. So income of old year taxable under Income Tax Act, assets of the old year taxable under the BMA. Yes, it's a different matter that while determining the value of assets in BMA, the income assessed under Income Tax Act, the reduction will need to be given under the BMA. But there could be a case where both the laws are applicable to an assessee when the income earned relates to the old years. So this is what is the broad distinction between BMA, Income Tax Act, how parallel proceedings can be initiated, what could be the defense when parallel proceedings are initiated under Income Tax Act and BMA. Now friends, the third most important aspect under the BMA which is the meaning of undisclosed assets located outside India. So friends, before I begin, I think we can take some queries if there are in the chat box. So there is one query from Mr. Narayan Iyer, who says that whether additional penalty of rupees 10 lakhs is only for foreign assets or it includes foreign income also, as it is not specifically mentioned of income. So it is the penalty, when we see the penalty provisions, it is with respect to non-disclosure of foreign income in the return of income. So it is both, according to me, it is both foreign assets and foreign income which can be made subject matter of penalty of rupees 10 lakhs under the BMA. But still, I'll just so it is both, friends. Section 42 deals with both assets and foreign income. So additional penalty will be levied if both assets and foreign income, either or, are not disclosed in the return of income. So these were the queries, friends. I'll move forward. So friends, the main subject matter for charge of tax under BMA is undisclosed asset located outside India, which we can also say an undisclosed foreign asset. The definition of undisclosed foreign asset, UFA, is defined in section 2 subsection 11, which defines it as an asset including a financial interest in any entity located outside India, held by the assessee in his name or in respect of which he is a beneficial owner, and he has no explanation about the source of investment in such asset, or the explanation given by him is, in the opinion of assessing officer, unsatisfactory. So friends, what is undisclosed foreign asset? Undisclosed foreign asset is an asset which is either held by the assessee directly in his name, or he's a beneficial owner in that asset. So one owner, or he's a beneficial owner, and he has no explanation about the source of investment. So in case an assessee holds a foreign asset, but he has an explanation behind the source of such investment, then it will not qualify to be an undisclosed foreign asset within the meaning of section 211. He may not have disclosed in the return of income, that's a different matter. But if he has an explainable source of investment, it will be outside the ambit of this definition. So the condition precedent is, one, he should be owner or beneficial owner, and he should have no explanation regarding source of investment. If these two twin conditions are satisfied, only then the foreign asset would qualify as undisclosed asset under section 211, otherwise not. Now there is no much dispute when a foreign asset is directly held in the name of assessee. I think it would be straight away fall within the meaning of undisclosed foreign asset. The major debate arises, what is the meaning of beneficial owner? So friends, one must draw, in my respectful submission, a distinction between a beneficial owner and beneficiary, and I'll explain how. In most of the cases where assets are held outside India, they are through the medium of offshore trusts. That is, a trust is created outside India where an Indian resident could be named as one of the beneficiaries in the trust, and then trust would hold assets, and therefore via medium of offshore trust, the Indian assessee becomes owner of the assets held by the trust. Now the question is whether merely because the Indian assessee is named as one of the beneficiaries in the trust, would he qualify to be a beneficial owner of the assets in turn held by the trust within the meaning of aforesaid section. Now the first important principle that needs to be kept in mind while deciding this debate is the decision of Supreme Court in this case of estate of late H.M. Vikram Singh Ji Gondal. In this case, it was clearly laid down by the Supreme Court that in case of discretionary trusts are those trusts where the percentage of the beneficiary is not fixed. If the percentage is fixed, the timing of distribution or the manner of distribution is not fixed. These are called indeterminate trusts. So in case of indeterminate trust, the beneficiary automatically do not become owner of the assets of the trust. It is only when the trust distributes the asset in the name of the beneficiary that the beneficiary becomes owner of the asset. So in case of discretionary trust, the concept of beneficial owner should not apply. Applying this decision of Supreme Court, the beneficial owner, the beneficiary will become owner. He will qualify to meet the test of direct ownership when the distribution is made by the trust to the hands of the beneficiary. So in case of offshore trust, my respectful submission is that the assessee is only the beneficiary and not the beneficial owner unless the distribution has happened. Then friends, there are various provisions in the Income Tax Act as well as in the BMA which makes distinction between beneficial owner and beneficiary itself. So friends, we have section 139 in Income Tax Act which deals with the requirement of filing return of income. It obligates an assessee to disclose its foreign assets and foreign income in the return of income. In that context, and the return form uses the expressions beneficial owner and beneficiary. In that context, explanation 4 and 5 of section 139(1) gives a separate definition to both beneficial owner and beneficiary. Let's have a look at these two definitions, which we will discuss further to elaborate the distinction between both these two concepts. The first is the definition of beneficial owner. How it has been defined? It is defined as beneficial owner means an individual who has provided directly or indirectly consideration for the asset for the immediate or future benefit, direct or indirect, of himself or any other person. So friends, as per this definition, beneficial owner is a person who has contributed directly or indirectly consideration for the acquisition of the asset. So in case there is no consideration flown from the assessee, but he is only named as a beneficiary in the assets acquired by a third person, as per this definition, he do not become beneficial owner. But whether he qualifies as a beneficiary, let's see the definition of beneficiary. Beneficiary has been defined to mean an individual who derives benefit from the asset during the previous year and the consideration for such asset has been provided by any other person other than the beneficiary. So where the consideration of asset is provided by any third person and the first person enjoys benefit of such asset, then he qualifies to be a beneficiary. So friends, there's a clear distinction as per the definition of these two terms under the Income Tax Act. Beneficial owner is something similar to a benamidar, that he has contributed directly or indirectly to the acquisition of the asset. He is ultimately the beneficiary, but the asset is not owned in his own name, but he's the beneficial owner. But the contribution to acquisition of asset is essential to qualify as beneficial owner. If he has not contributed, but he has been named as beneficiary, then he qualifies to be a beneficiary. But friends, when we see section 211, it is only the beneficial owner who has been made subject to BMA tax and not the beneficiary. So therefore, if I am only the beneficiary of the asset and not the contributor of the asset, I am a beneficiary but not the beneficial owner, and therefore outside the ambit of BMA. And this distinction has even been recognized by the CBDT in its circular number 13 of 2015, where they have said that if you are, as per the definition, a beneficiary and not a beneficial owner, then you cannot come for declaration under the voluntary scheme. So CBDT itself has admitted the distinction between these two words and have imported the definition of beneficial owner and beneficiary for the purposes of BMA. And another important point, friends, which needs to be taken note of is section 215 of the BMA, which says that all words and expressions used in the BMA but not defined have to be imported their meaning from the Income Tax Act unless otherwise the context requires otherwise. So if the context is not different, then the definitions in the Income Tax Act are to be imported in the BMA. And in my respectful submission, the context of this definition under the Income Tax Act and BMA is same. Why same? Because even under section 139(1) of Income Tax Act, these definitions have been provided with respect to ownership of foreign income or foreign assets by Indian residents. Same is the context of BMA. So when the context of BMA and Income Tax Act is same, then the definitions in Income Tax Act needs to be willy-nilly imported for the purposes of BMA. And then friends, it is not only section 211 which only uses the word beneficial owner and do not uses the word beneficiary. When we see subsequent provisions of BMA, more particularly with respect to penalties contained, penalty and prosecution contained in 42, 43, 49 and 50, the statute itself uses both the expressions together. So in these sections, it is provided that if the assessee is a beneficial owner or beneficiary and he has not declared it in the return of income, then he is subject to penalty or prosecution under these provisions. So when it comes to penalty, it imports both the defaults. That is, if the assessee is a beneficial owner, he has not reported he is subject to penalty. If he is a beneficiary which is used separately, he is subjected to penalty. So under the penalty provisions, legislature has specifically drawn distinction between these two expressions. So when both the expressions are understood differently under the Income Tax Act as well as under the BMA, then we have to understood that word differently for purpose of 211 also. And a beneficiary should not be considered, should not be considered as undisclosed foreign asset for the purposes of section 2(11) of the Act. And friends, we also have a decision of Delhi Bench of Tribunal in the case of Jatinder Mehra, which I'll discuss, which has partly accepted this theory and partly not, and I'll explain how. Now, in this Jatinder Mehra's case, what had happened, that a offshore trust, offshore bank accounts, offshore companies were incorporated by son of an Indian resident. The son was non-resident, but father, who was the assessee herein, was an Indian resident. Now, he was named as beneficiary in the offshore trust. That naming could be for any reason. Friends, it is seen that in case of mainly American citizens, they incorporate offshore trust and they give the name of an Indian resident, because if they would have included their name in the offshore trust, as per the American laws, global income of an American citizen is taxable under America. So in order to avoid that controversy, the American citizen named Indian resident father of the assessee as beneficial owner on the premise that he will escape taxation under American laws, and Indian laws are not that stringent to catch hold of him, and therefore and even the Indian father will be outside the ambit of Indian laws, and therefore for that reason he named the Indian father as beneficial owner in the offshore entities. Now the question arose before the tribunal in this case that when the father has not contributed anything to the offshore trust, just because he is named as beneficial owner in the offshore trust documents, whether he could be considered as beneficial owner for the purpose of section 211. Now the Delhi Bench of Tribunal examined the meaning of beneficial owner in various laws, in Companies Act, in Benami law, in PMLA, in multiple other laws. And when it come to the conclusion that the definition of beneficial owner is somewhat similar to what is defined under the Income Tax Act, it did not automatically imported the meaning of beneficial owner in Income Tax Act. In fact, they said that the definition of Income Tax Act cannot automatically be opened up, cannot be roped in BMA contrary to section 215. But be that as it may, they even otherwise held that when we see the definition of beneficial owner in the normal parlance, in the definition given in the various acts, the contribution to the asset is important to consider the assessee to be the beneficial owner. If he's only the beneficiary, if only he's named as the beneficiary in the asset, then he's not the beneficial owner. So in those facts, the Delhi Tribunal also recognized the distinction between beneficial owner and beneficiary and held that merely because assessee is named as beneficial owner in the offshore trust, he cannot be roped in. He cannot be considered as holder of undisclosed foreign assets for the purposes of charging tax under section 211 of the BMA. So even the Indian jurisprudence holds and upholds the aforesaid view. But we have a partly contrary decision by the Mumbai Bench of Tribunal in the recent decision of Rashesh Manhar Bhansali. Now in that case, Bombay Tribunal has partly dissented from the Delhi Bench of Tribunal and have held that the meaning of beneficial owner in Income Tax Act cannot be roped in automatically for the purposes of BMA. And in those facts, since the assessee was not able to establish the source of investment in foreign assets, on the basis of presumption, the Bombay Tribunal held that assessee could be considered as beneficiary in those assets because he's named as beneficiary in the offshore documents. So despite non-proving of the source of investment in foreign assets, the Bombay Tribunal in this case has upheld the Indian assessee to be the beneficial owner of the foreign asset. But it is in its own facts where no evidence could be brought on record. Even the assessee could not support the tax authorities to prove the source behind investment. In those facts, the Bombay Tribunal took a different view. So it may not be a ratio for all the decision. It's a ratio in the facts of the given case. But still, the important finding of the Mumbai Tribunal in the aforesaid case is that the definition of beneficial owner cannot automatically be imported in the BMA Act. So in that sense, friends, we have a dissent as on date, one from the decision of Delhi Tribunal, the other from the decision of Mumbai Tribunal, and the third from the CBDT circular, where they said that the meaning of income tax needs to be imported under the BMA and not the definition of beneficial owner given under any other acts. So friend, this is what is an important point of distinction between beneficial owner and beneficiary, which must be kept in mind while developing our cases before appellate authorities and establishing whether the assessee is a beneficial owner in the foreign assets or not. I repeat, in case we are only a beneficiary named in the offshore documents, but not beneficial owner by way of contribution, then it's a very good defense which can be developed to say that we are outside the ambit of undisclosed foreign assets under section 211 of the Act. So any cases, I'm just seeing if there are any cases. So there are no queries on this issue. I'll proceed further. Now, friends, I was discussing about the issue of prospective applicability of BMA or retrospective applicability of BMA. So what are the arguments in favor of the proposition that law is prospective? The implication of law to be considered as prospective is that while it is clear that foreign income can be taxed only from AY 16, 17 and onwards, but if the law is considered to be prospective, then even the foreign assets acquired prior to 1416 will also be outside the ambit of BMA and they cannot be charged to tax under the new law. What are the reasons to say that the law is prospective and not retrospective? There are a couple of reasons. First, when we see section 1.3, which provides when the law has come into force, it specifically says that law is to be considered to have come into force from 1/7/2015. So section 1.3 says law is in force after 1/7/2015. That's the first indication of law to be prospective in nature. Then second is, friends, section 3.1, which says that tax under the BMA shall be charged for an assessment year commencing on or after 1/4/2016. So charging section, which is section 3, which brings to charge undisclosed foreign assets and undisclosed foreign income, specifically provides that the charge of tax is from 1/4/2016. So this is the second indication as to why the law is prospective in nature. And friends, it's a settled legal proposition repeatedly held by Supreme Court in various cases that when the intention of the legislature is clear to make the law prospective and it has not been specifically provided that the law is to be given retrospective effect, then it is to be understood as having a prospective effect, and that is, one can refer to this decision of Supreme Court in the case of Vatika Township. So on the basis of these two specific provisions, one can argue that law is prospective and therefore assets acquired prior to 1/4/16 should also be outside the ambit of BMA. Friends, with respect to foreign assets, there are two controversies. One, whether the asset acquired prior to 1/4/16 should at all be subject to this new law, or assets which have been acquired and which have already been disposed of prior to the enactment would be subject matter of BMA or not. For instance, I had a bank account, there were deposits in the bank account, but the money was withdrew, bank account was closed prior to the enactment of BMA. So whether those kind of assets would also be covered under the BMA or not. I had a property outside India which was acquired prior to 1416 and sold prior to 1416. Whether those assets could also be subject to BMA or not on the ground of retrospective applicability also, and also for the second reason, that is the definition of undisclosed asset in section 211 which we just read. As per that definition, it is the foreign asset which is held by the assessee or in respect of which he is a beneficial owner. So when we literally read the definition of undisclosed foreign asset in section 211, it requires that asset should be continued to be held by the assessee by the use of word held and by the use of word is. That is, assessee is a beneficial owner. Is to be understood as in the present tense, that assessee is continuing to hold the asset. That is why the word used is. In case the asset is not held after 1416 and has already been disposed of, then on strict interpretation, it do not fall, it do not fit in the definition of undisclosed foreign asset under section 211. So for this reason also, it could be argued that the assets which have already been disposed are outside the ambit of BMA. This is the third reason. And the fourth, friends, is Article 20 subsection 1 of the Constitution of India, which says that no person shall be convicted of any offense except for violation of a law in force at the time of the commission of the act charged as an offense. So this is also important, friends. Article 20 subsection 1 specifically provides that there can be no law enacted. A person cannot be convicted of an offense which was not there. The law was not there when the law was enacted. So when I acquired a foreign asset, there was no BMA. It was only Income Tax Act. And friends, the courts have held that the offense should be a criminal offense. So when we see BMA, BMA has also been kept at parity with a criminal offense by providing higher rigorous imprisonment by way of prosecution, by including it as part of an PMLA offense. So the statute itself is considering it to be a criminal offense. So I cannot be charged with an offense of criminality when the law was not there at the time when the offense was incurred. So clearly, by applying the provisions of Article 21, one can argue that the law, even if the statute intends to have a retrospective effect, but it is in the teeth of Article 21 and it cannot have a retrospective effect. So these are the multiple arguments on the basis of which one can argue that the law is prospective in nature and not retrospective, and therefore the assets acquired prior to 1416 are outside the ambit of BMA, or assets acquired and disposed prior to 14/2016 are also outside the ambit of BMA. So these are the arguments in favor of prospective applicability. But what are the arguments against? What are the armors? What are the weapons in the armory of department? The first is section 72C in the Income Tax Act. Friends, section 72C is like a residuary provision, which is like placed under the head of removal of doubts to provide that, friends, as I pointed out, there was a voluntary disclosure scheme under the BMA to giving an option to the assessee to come out clean prior to the enactment. It is in those chapter, section 72 has been inserted as under the head of removal of doubts to provide that in case the assessee has not voluntarily disclosed the assets in the voluntary declaration scheme, then those foreign assets shall be deemed to have been acquired in the year when it comes to the notice of the assessing officer. So it is because of this provision, by way of a deeming fiction, the law itself says that asset will be deemed to be acquired after 1/4/2016. Because of this provision, the tax authorities say that the law has a retrospective applicability. But the question is whether section 72C, which is couched under the residuary head of removal of doubts, can override the substantive charging provision of section 3 or section 1(3), which specifically says that law is applicable from 1/4/2016. So the question is whether charging section will prevail or a residuary provision would prevail. In my view, it is the charging section, and by way of it deeming fiction, you cannot override the charging section, as also it is in the teeth of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. Then there are several queries given in the CBDT circular to provide that assets acquired prior to 1/4/2016, these were circular issued to give clarifications with respect to disclosures in the voluntary declaration scheme. In that circular also, the CBDT has advised that assets acquired prior to 1/4/2016 are to be included in the voluntary declaration scheme. So therefore, this is also an indication that intent of the legislature is to give a retrospective effect to the BMA. And friends, in any case, when they gave the option of voluntary declaration scheme at the time which was announced prior to 1/4/16, clearly the intent was to give an option to the assessees to disclose assets which have been acquired prior to 1/4/16. So this is another implication that the intention of the law is to give its effect with retrospective effect. But the question is not the intention of the legislature, whether the legislature, despite having an intent, can make a law retrospectively applicable by virtue of Article 21 of the Constitution. And friends, we have decision in the case of Benami law, where similarly the effect was sought to be given retrospectively of the Benami law. The high courts, various high courts in the country have held that Benami law cannot be given a retrospective effect. So drawing same analogy, even the Black Money Act, in my view, cannot have a retrospective effect. But we have some jurisprudence available on this issue also. We have this famous case of Delhi High Court, which was subsequently partly modified by the Supreme Court in case of Gautam Khaitan. Friends, it is important to discuss this decision while discussing this controversy of retrospectivity and prospectivity. So what had happened? The writ petition was filed before the Delhi High Court in the case of Gautam Khaitan, where one of the issue raised was with respect to retrospective applicability of the BMA in the assessee's case in that matter. The Delhi High Court granted stay to the assessee on a limited ground that when the legislature when the parliament passed the BMA Act, the effective date of the act was 1/4/2016. Subsequently, by way of a difficulty of removal orders, the government, the CBDT, predated the effective date of the law from 1/4/16 to 1/7/2015. It was this act of the CBDT that was commented upon by the Delhi High Court, that when the Parliament has made the law effective from 1/4/16, then the CBDT cannot. It is beyond the power of CBDT to predate the effective date from 1/4/16 to 1/7/2015, and on that limited ground, a stay was granted by the Delhi High Court in the case of Gautam Khaitan, reported at 415 ITR 99. Now, against that interim order, it was an interim order. Against that interim order, an SLP was filed by the department before the Supreme Court. The interim order was reversed by the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court gave a lot of observations as to the retrospective applicability of the law. There are observations of the Honorable Supreme Court which says that the law is retrospectively applicable, and therefore the assets acquired prior to 1/4/2016 can also be subject to BMA. But in the end, the Supreme Court says that we are only reversing the order of the Delhi High Court. We are setting aside the matter back to the Delhi High Court to re-decide the controversy without being influenced by our observations. So while there are observations, but in the same breath, the Supreme Court has said that Delhi High Court will decide the issue afresh without being affected by these observations. So having regard to this final finding of the Supreme Court, in my view, the issue of prospective and retrospective applicability of the law is still open and is already sub judice before the Honorable Delhi High Court. So we cannot say that with the decision of Supreme Court, this issue is freezed for the moment. Yes, there are observations, but because of the final finding of the Supreme Court, those observations cannot be considered, in my respectful submission, as the binding ratio of the Honorable Supreme Court under Article 141 of the Constitution. So for that reason, the matter of retrospective and prospective applicability is still open. But friends, yes, the recent decision of Bombay Tribunal, which I just discussed in the case of Rashesh Manhar, in this case, there are observations from the Mumbai Tribunal where they have followed the decision of Supreme Court to say that no, the law is applicable retrospectively. But since it was a normal appeal, the Bombay Tribunal could not have traveled and has not traveled or not examined the applicability of Article 21 of the Constitution. I think that question is still open and that will be decided by courts, and that question could not have been decided by the tribunal in an appeal, because the tribunal was only adjudicating on the merits and could not have decided upon the constitutional aspects of the law, which would be decided, which is open and which will be decided by the courts. So this is where, friends, the issue of prospective and retrospective applicability stands as on date. But it is advisable that we take this plea and take an objection before the lower authorities that old assets, old acquisitions, or old acquisitions which have been disposed should not be brought within the purview of BMA. In the Mumbai bench tribunal, friends, the tribunal not only upheld the retrospectivity applicability, but also examined the definition of undisclosed foreign asset under section 211 to reverse the argument that the asset should be continued to be held. So the Bombay Tribunal has categorically held that if the asset is disposed prior to 1/4/2016, it can still be considered as undisclosed foreign asset and be brought to tax under BMA. So I'm just checking if there are any questions. So no questions, friends. I'm moving, friends. I'm moving forward, and if there will be questions at the end, I will take at the end of my presentation. So finally, friends, assessment procedure. What is the procedure for assessing undisclosed foreign income and assets under BMA? The procedure of assessment, friends, is contained in section 10 and section 10 and 11 of the Black Money Act. Section 10 provides for initiation of assessment proceedings, and section 11 provides for passing of the assessment order. So first we deal with section 10 subclause 1, which provides for initiation of assessment proceedings under BMA. So when we see section 10, friends, there is no time limit prescribed to issue notice for initiating proceedings. So when we contrast this to Income Tax Act, we all are aware that there is a time limit prescribed to initiate assessment proceedings, be it for a regular scrutiny assessment through issue of notice under section 143(2), there is a specific time limit prescribed in the statute, or reassessment proceedings under section 147, there is a time limit prescribed, or for 263 likewise. But there is no time limit prescribed for issuance of notice under section 10(1) of BMA. So the question arises whether in the absence of any time limit prescribed, whether AO can issue notice at any point of time at its dixie. Let us try to find answers to this query by both reading the section as also certain guidelines which are available, guidelines issued by CBDT. First, when we see the section says that the assessing officer may, on receipt of an information from an income tax authority under the Income Tax Act or any other authority under any law for the time being in force, or on coming of any information to his notice, serve on any person requiring him initiating the proceedings. So the requirement of law is on receipt of information or coming to the notice of any information. So according to me, friends, section itself prescribes that AO has to issue notice immediately on receipt of information, although I am using the word immediately myself, but the word on used in the aforesaid section itself implies that AO has to issue notice on receipt of information, either immediately on receipt of information, or at least a reasonable time limit has to be written in the section. Friends, we have cases, ample of cases in various laws, including Income Tax Act, that where no time limit has been prescribed in the statute, then a reasonable time limit has to be read in by virtue of the overarching law of limitation. There cannot be unabated powers available with the tax authorities to initiate proceedings in an unlimited time period. Some reasonable time limit has to be read in. So as per the general principles of interpretation of limitation, that reasonable time limit has to be read in. Secondly, by virtue of the language of section 10(1), which provides that AO has to issue notice on receipt of information or on coming to the notice of the income tax authority. The use of word on implies that it has to be immediately issued. Then friends, we have guidelines by the CBDT dated 23/1/2018. These are, friends, the standard operating procedures which were issued by the CBDT for providing guidelines to the assessing officer as to how to handle the cases of black money, which has even been noted by Delhi High Court in this case of Harvansh Chawla versus Ministry of Finance. In these guidelines, it is specifically provided that the concerned assessing officer should preferably issue a show cause notice within 30 days from the end of the financial year in which he became aware of foreign assets / foreign income. So guidelines itself provides us a time limit. So we can consider the guidelines issued by CBDT as a reasonable time limit for the purpose of issue of notice, that is 30 days from the end of the financial year. So in case the notice is issued after this period of 30 days, we certainly have an objection to be raised before the tax authorities to say that this issuance of notice is time barred. Then friends, there could be an issue of concurrent jurisdiction. It may please be noted that in order to give a focused approach under the BMA and also to reduce time limits for completing assessments under BMA, the investigation officers in the income tax department have been provided concurrent jurisdiction of making assessment under BMA. So investigating officer of Income Tax Act as well as of BMA is also the assessing officer under BMA. Under Income Tax Act, investigation wing and assessment wing is different. The investigation wing carries out its investigation, gives its result to the assessing officer who carries out the assessment. But for the purposes of BMA, the dual responsibility has been given to the investigation wing also in most of the jurisdictions. In not all, but in most of the jurisdictions, by virtue of a circular in pari materia to section 120 of the Income Tax Act, the jurisdiction of assessing officer has also been given to the investigation officers. So the question arises, when as an investigation officer of an income tax authority, the information is received as an investigation officer of an income tax authority, whether he has to issue notice, whether on the basis of the information received as an investigation of an officer, he has to immediately issue, or he can wait, he can carry out the investigation and subsequently issue notice under BMA. To my mind, as soon as the officer who is holding a concurrent jurisdiction of an investigation officer of an income tax authority as also the assessing officer of BMA, then he has to immediately issue notice after receipt of that information, maybe at best within a period of 30 days from the end of financial year. He cannot wait by virtue of carrying out investigation under the income tax department as an income tax officer and subsequently issue notice under BMA at its ipsi dixi. He has to follow the timelines of reasonable time limit prescribed in section 10(1), read with CBDT guidelines. So that we can see, friends. Then friends, as we have seen in income tax law, there is a requirement to record satisfaction or to form reasons to believe before initiating proceedings, new proceedings under the Income Tax Act. For instance, for the purpose of section 147, the erstwhile provisions of section 147 provided the assessing officer to record reasons to believe before initiating proceedings under section 147 and issue notice under section 148. Even in case of search, the search team had to have reasons to believe before initiating search upon a person under section 132 of the Income Tax Act. But unlike this requirement of reasons to believe regarding reasons to satisfaction, there is no such provision in section 10 of BMA. The question is whether immediately on receipt of information, the tax authorities under BMA would need to initiate proceedings under section 10(1) of BMA. Shouldn't the requirement of satisfaction, requirement of application of mind be read in the statute, or the BMA officers have power to initiate proceedings immediately on receipt of information? Whether they do not have to record any satisfaction, they do not have to apply their mind on the information before initiating proceedings. According to me, while there is no requirement to record satisfaction, but the basic requirement of application of mind has to be read in. It cannot be that somebody gives information of holding of foreign asset or foreign income by an assessee, the BMA officer initiates proceedings. He has to apply his mind. He has to carry out some investigation before checking whether that information is correct or not and initiate proceedings. That basic requirement has to be read in the section. If that information is subsequently found to be false and BMA officer to be acting on that false information, then these proceedings are void ab initio. These need to go. That requirement has to be read in the section. And we have some guidance for this by the same CBDT guidelines which I just referred to. The CBDT guidelines specifically provides that it is recommended information should not be the sole basis of issuing notice. Notice must be issued after some prima facie satisfaction, after conducting necessary inquiries in terms of powers vested with BMA authorities under section 8 of BMA. So even guidelines say that there should be some application of mind by the BMA authorities before they initiate proceedings. These are draconian proceedings. These cause a lot of harassment to the assessee. So therefore, it cannot be simply on the basis of information as provided in section 10(1) that an information received, issue notice. It is required that the tax authorities examine that information. They conduct some inquiry and they come. They are satisfied. So the requirement of satisfaction, prima facie satisfaction, is automatically embedded in the section. It may not have been written in the section, but it has to be read in by virtue of the principles of natural justice. So friends, this should also be kept in mind, whether or not the officer has applied mind to the information received by him. If there is lack of application of mind, or there is non-application of mind on the part of officer before issuing notice, in my view, that's a subject matter of challenge. So that should be kept in mind, friends. So these are, friends, few objections that should be kept in mind while dealing with notices issued under section 10(1) of BMA. Although there is no time limit, but that time limit has to be read in. A reasonable time limit has to be read in. There is no requirement to record satisfaction explicitly in the section, but on the principles of natural justice, read with the guidelines issued by CBDT, that requirement, in my respectful submission, needs to be read in. And if these two requirements are not satisfied, that's a valid ground for raising objection before the BMA authorities. Moving to section 11, friends. While there is no time limit to issue notice under section 10(1), but a specific time limit has been prescribed to pass order under section 11 of BMA. Time limit to pass assessment order has been prescribed as 2 years from the end of the financial year in which notice under section 10(1) was issued by the assessing officer. So he may have taken time in issuing notice, but once proceedings are initiated, notice has been issued, they have to be completed within a period of 2 years from the end of the financial year in which notice is issued. Then there are certain exclusions while computing time limit to pass the assessment order. These are similar to those provided in explanation to section 153 of the Income Tax Act. For instance, if the proceedings are stayed by the High Court, then the period of stay is to be excluded. The important point which I am discussing in this presentation is exclusion of time period for references made, foreign references made through FT&TR division of the CBDT. So since these are international tax matters relating to collecting information regarding foreign assets and foreign income of assessee, the foreign references are bound to happen. So in order to cover the time taken in getting information on foreign references, the section 11 by way of explanation 1 specifically provides that the time taken in receipt of information pursuant to foreign references ought to be excluded in the aforesaid period of time limit of 2 years. But it's not that the entire time taken in receiving information pursuant to foreign reference is to be excluded. It provides that where multiple references are made, then the time taken from the date of first reference to the receipt of information from the last reference or a period of 1 year, whichever is less is to be excluded. Whichever less means that in case the time taken in receipt of information on foreign references is 1.5 years, then it is only the 1 year which will be excluded. So this may kindly be noted. But friends, I am raising an important controversy here. In practice, we see that foreign references are made even prior to issue of notice under section 10(1). It is at the stage of investigation itself that foreign references are made and multiple references are made, and those references are continued. If partial information is received, the AO issues notice under section 10(1), and then those references are again continued. So the question is whether the references made, time taken in sending reference and receiving information for period prior to issue of notice under section 10(1), whether is to be excluded or not, or whether the first reference for the purpose of exclusion is to be seen as the reference made after issuance of notice under section 10(1). It's an open question. But when we literally read the provision relating to aforesaid exclusion of time period, it talks about first of the multiple references. In my view, all these references are tagged along, whether the reference is made at the stage of investigation or after issue of 10(1), but all these references are tagged along. So for the purpose of interpreting the provision relating to exclusion, we have to see the first of the multiple references. First of the multiple references will be the period, will be the reference made prior to issue of notice under section 10(1). So on literal interpretation of multiple references which are tagged along, which are continuous in the form of references made at the stage of investigation, which are continued after issue of notice under section 10(1), the period to be counted is from the date of first reference, and therefore the period from the first reference till the stage of 10(1) notice has to be also excluded. And it is only the period from issue of notice under 10(1) and the receipt of information from the last reference or 1 year has to be excluded. The AO will not get an additional time of 1 year or to count the period of 1 year from the first reference made after issue of 10(1) notice. It has to be seen from the first reference made even at the stage of investigation. So this point may also kindly be noted while computing the time period. In case the AO counts time period after the first reference made after issue of notice under section 10(1), then this could certainly be a ground to object to count the period of limitation, to object, to raise an objection, or to check whether the assessment order has been passed within the limitation period or not. So this point may also kindly be noted, friends. So this was all, friends. Then there are similar provisions like rectification of mistake, power to issue revision order, and similar to section 263, 264, penalties, interest, all are similar to Income Tax Act. I'm not dwelling into much, but the idea was to give a brief overview of the BMA law, what kind of objections can be raised, what kind of defenses that are available. It's a new law. It's at the developing stage. Notwithstanding one or two contrary decisions or favorable decision, we should try to raise all kind of objections which I discussed in my presentation while representing the matter before BMA authorities, because we don't know how the law will develop. It's a new law. So the idea was to give the overview of the law, the brief overview of how law works, what kind of objections can be raised, what is the subject matter of this law. And I hope I was able to give a proper presentation. My audience was able to understand. I would be glad if there are any questions. My email ID and my phone number is mentioned on the slides, and I will be happy to take up any questions or queries at any subsequent point of time. Thank you so much, friends. Over to Aman.